My name is Sterling Harrison, and I am 74 years old. I spent the better part of 40 years as a lead civil engineer, designing the skeletal steel and reinforced concrete that keeps the skyline of this country from collapsing under its own weight. I understand foundations. I understand the exact point at which a beam will buckle under a load it wasn't meant to carry. What I didn't understand, until a rainy Tuesday in October, was how easily a human being can be dismantled by the very person they spent their life protecting. I was in my dressing room in our historic home in Greenwich, polishing my black Oxfords. It was a ritual every Tuesday. I drove 20 minutes to my daughter's estate for dinner. It was the anchor of my week, the one night I didn't have to face the silence of the house alone since my wife, Rosemary, passed away 5 years ago. I was just reaching for a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir I'd pulled from the cellar when I knew my daughter, Serafina, loved when my phone buzzed on the mahogany dresser. It was a text from Theodore Teddy Beaumont. Teddy has been my attorney and my closest friend since we were both making pennies at junior firms in the city. He never texts. He's a man of phone calls and leather-bound briefs. The screen lit up with 4 words that felt like a structural failure in my chest. Call me. Now. Emergency. My hand shook, just a fraction of an inch, as I put the wine bottle down. I dialed his private line. He didn't even say hello. Sterling, where are you? Are you at the house? His voice was tight, vibrating with an urgency that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I'm in the dressing room, Teddy. I'm heading to Serafina's for dinner. What's happened? Is there a problem with the trust? Sterling, listen to me very carefully, Teddy said, and I heard the rustle of papers on his end. I just received a formal notice from a firm downtown. They're representing your daughter and her husband, Vance Montgomery. They've filed a petition in probate court to have you declared legally incompetent. They are moving for an emergency conservatorship over your entire estate, Sterling. They're claiming you're in a state of rapid cognitive decline. The room seemed to tilt. I reached out and gripped the edge of the dresser, my knuckles turning white. Me? Incompetent? I had just finished reviewing a set of blueprints for a bridge restoration project in New Haven the week before. I managed a 7-figure portfolio that had outperformed the S&P for a decade. I was the man people called when they needed logic, precision, and strength. On what grounds? I managed to rasp out. They've attached a preliminary declaration from a Dr. Sterling Thorne, Teddy said, his voice dripping with disgust. He's a forensic psychiatrist known for being a hired gun. They allege you've been making erratic financial decisions, showing signs of paranoia, and that you're unable to manage your daily affairs. Sterling, they aren't just looking for a seat at the table. They want the table, the chairs, and the house they're sitting in. A cold, bitter laugh almost escaped me. Erratic decisions? Was he talking about the $3 million I'd handed Serafina and Vance for their palatial estate in the gated community of North Ridge? A house they had no business owning on Vance's consulting salary. Or was it the $50,000 a year I was paying for my grandson Julian's elite boarding school? I had been a bank to them, a resource. And apparently the bank was getting too old to keep the vault open. Sterling, are you still there? Teddy asked. I'm here, I said, my voice hardening. The engineer in me was starting to take over. When a bridge is failing, you don't panic. You look for the stress fracture. You calculate the load. I have dinner there tonight. My weekly Tuesday dinner. You cannot go, Teddy insisted. Stay home. Lock the doors. We need to file a stay immediately. If you go there, they'll use every word you say, every time you stumble over a sentence, as evidence. You're walking into a trap. I looked at the black Oxfords I'd just polished. They shone like glass. No, Teddy. I'm going. I'm going to look my daughter in the eye while she lies to me. I want to see the face of the person who thinks I'm a broken machine. Sterling, don't be a fool. I'm going, I repeated, my voice as steady as a steel girder. But Teddy, start digging. I want to know everything. I want to know why they're in such a hurry. People don't commit a moral crime this heinous unless they're drowning. I hung up before he could argue. I didn't take the Pinot Noir. I went back to the cellar and grabbed a dusty, unlabeled bottle of table wine I'd bought at a grocery store 3 years ago. If I was going to a theater of lies, I wasn't going to provide the top-shelf props. The drive to North Ridge was a blur of gray Connecticut rain and the rhythmic slapping of the windshield wipers. I drove across the bridge I'd helped reinforce 20 years ago, feeling the vibration of the tires on the asphalt. I had built my life on what I thought was bedrock family, legacy, love. I was realizing now that I had built it on shifting silt and the tide was coming in fast. When I pulled into the sweeping, circular driveway of the Montgomery estate, the house was ablaze with light. It was a monument to excess that I had funded. Vance opened the door before I could even reach for the knocker. He had the perpetually damp handshake and the expensive, ill-fitting suit of a man who was always trying to sell something that didn't exist. "Sterling. There he is," Vance boomed, his voice a bit too loud, his smile a bit too wide. "We were starting to wonder if you'd gotten lost." "The rain is a bear, isn't it?" "I don't get lost, Vance," I said, handing him the cheap bottle of wine. "I know exactly where I am." He glanced at the bottle, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face before he masked it with a fake chuckle. "Great, great. Serafina's just finishing up in the kitchen. Come in. Get warm." The foyer was 2 stories of white marble and gold leaf. The smell of roasted lamb and expensive herbs filled the air, but all I felt was a cold, hollow nausea. Serafina glided out of the dining room, looking like a portrait of her mother, Rosemary. But where Rosemary's eyes were filled with a soft, genuine warmth, Serafina's were bright, hard, and assessing. She wasn't looking at her father. She was looking at a set of assets. "Dad," she said, coming forward to hug me. I braced myself. The embrace was dry, practiced. I felt her arms tighten around me for a second longer than usual, not in affection, but as if she were testing my weight, checking to see if I was still standing upright. "How are you feeling?" "You look tired." "I'm fine, Serafina." "Just a long day at the office," I said, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Vance spent 20 minutes rambling about a new biotech venture he was investing in, while Serafina watched me with an intensity that was unnerving. Every time I reached for my water, she leaned in. Every time I paused to think of a word, she'd finish the sentence for me, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You don't have to strain yourself, Dad," she'd say. "We know it's a lot to keep track of." Then, over dessert, the hammer dropped. Serafina set her fork down and reached across the table, covering my hand with hers. Her skin was cold. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into a rehearsed, melodic tone of concern. "Vance and I have been talking. We're so worried about you being all alone in that big house. The maintenance, the taxes, the investments. It's a burden you shouldn't have to carry anymore." Vance chimed in, nodding solemnly. "You've worked your whole life, Sterling. You deserve to relax. We've been looking into some options, some ways to help you manage everything so you don't have to worry about a single thing." I looked at my daughter, my only child, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike, the woman whose law school tuition I'd paid without a second thought. "What kind of options, Serafina?" "Just a partnership," she said, her thumb rubbing a small, irritating circle on the back of my hand. "A way for us to handle the day-to-day. We could move you closer to us. Maybe sell the Greenwich house, it's so drafty, anyway, and put the proceeds into a more secure management fund. One that Vance and I can oversee for you." They wanted me to sign my life away. They wanted the house, the portfolio, and my freedom, and they wanted me to thank them for it. "That's a very thorough plan," I said, my voice low. I withdrew my hand from hers. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into my decline." Serafina's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flash of something panic, crossed her face. "We just want what's best for you, Dad. You've been so forgetful lately. Like that time you forgot Julian's birthday?" "I didn't forget his birthday, Serafina," I said calmly. "I sent the gift to the school because he told me he wouldn't be home." "Perhaps you forgot that." The tension in the room became a physical weight. Vance cleared his throat, his eyes darting to Serafina. "Anyway, no need to decide tonight. Just think about it. We've got some papers we'd like you to look over next week. Just standard stuff." I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. "I've seen enough for one night. Thank you for the lamb. It was well-seasoned." At the door, Serafina hugged me again. This time, she whispered into my ear, her voice a chilling contrast to her dutiful daughter persona. "Don't be stubborn, Dad. Things are going to change, whether you're ready or not. We're doing this because we love you." I didn't answer. I got into my car and drove straight to Teddy's office in the city. The lights were on the Muybornth floor. He was waiting. When I walked in, he had a thick file open on his desk. He looked up, his face pale. "How was it?" "It was a funeral," I said, tossing my keys onto his desk. "Mine. They've already spent the money in their heads, Teddy. They're talking about selling the house. They're talking about managing me into a grave." Teddy sighed, rubbing his eyes. "It's worse than I thought, Sterling. My investigator just sent over a preliminary report on Vance Montgomery. He's not just investing in biotech. He's been playing the high-stakes markets with money he doesn't have. He's underwater to the tune of $4 million. And the creditors? They aren't the kind of people who send polite letters. I sat down, the gravity of the betrayal finally sinking in. They weren't just greedy, they were desperate. And a desperate predator is the most dangerous kind. So, I said, leaning forward, they have a hired gun psychiatrist, a $4 million debt, and a plan to strip me of my legal rights. What do we have? Teddy looked at me, a grim smile playing on his lips. We have the fact that they think you're a confused old man. We have the fact that they've underestimated the man who built the foundations of this city. He pulled a small black device from his drawer. And we have this. If they want to play a game of perceptions, Sterling, we're going to give them a performance they'll never forget. But first, I need to know. What did Rosemary tell you 5 years ago, right before she died? You mentioned something about a safety net she left behind. I felt a cold shiver. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years. Rosemary, on her deathbed, clutching my hand, her voice a ragged whisper. Sterling, if the day ever comes when the pillars start to fall, look in the ash box of the old summer house. I hoped you'd never need it. I looked at Teddy. I think it's time I took a trip to the summer house. Wait, Teddy said, his hand stopping me. Before you go, there's one more thing. The court date for the emergency hearing? It's not next month. It's not next week. When is it? I asked. It's in 48 hours, Teddy said. They're trying to blindside you before you can even mount a defense. You have 2 days to prove you aren't losing your mind, or to lose it so spectacularly that they walk right into the trap we're about to set. I stood up, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic fury. 48 hours. That's more than enough time to tear down a house built on lies. What I didn't know yet was that the safety net Rosemary had left wasn't just money. It was a secret that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my daughter and the man she had married. The rain didn't stop. It followed me like a cold shadow as I drove north toward the Berkshires, leaving the polished, treacherous streets of Greenwich behind. My mind was a chaotic blueprint of memories, each one shifting under the weight of Teddy's revelation. 48 hours. In 48 hours, a judge would look at a man who had designed skyscrapers and see nothing but a crumbling monument. I'd always thought of Serafina as my greatest achievement. Not the bridges, not the skyscrapers, but her. She was the golden girl of the Montgomery line, a blend of my precision and Rosemary's effortless grace. I remember her at 7, sitting on my lap in my study, helping me draw lines on vellum with my drafting pens. I thought I was teaching her about structure. I didn't realize I was teaching her how to find the weak points. The first crack in the foundation didn't appear overnight. It was a slow, agonizing erosion that I chose to ignore because the truth was too painful to face. It started 6 years ago, when she brought Vance Montgomery home. Vance was everything I'd spent my life avoiding: slick, loud, and possessed of a smile that felt like a sales pitch. He claimed to be old money from a Virginia family that had lost its luster but kept its pride. I saw through the prestigious veneer within 10 minutes. He didn't have the calluses of a man who worked for his wealth. He had the hungry eyes of a man who wanted to inherit it. I remember Rosemary pulling me aside in the kitchen that first Thanksgiving. She was basting the turkey, but her eyes were fixed on Vance, who was currently holding court in the living room, bragging about a disruptive tech startup he was launching. Sterling, she whispered, her voice tight with a rare sharpness. That man is a scavenger. He's not here for Serafina. He's here for the shadow you cast. I'd laughed it off. I told her she was being overprotective. I told her Serafina was smart, she'd see through him. But Vance was a master of the long game. He didn't attack. He encroached. He started small, asking for advice on investments, then bridge loans for projects that always seemed to be just 1 month away from a massive payout. After Rosemary died, the encroachment turned into a siege. The grief had left me hollow, and Serafina and Vance moved into the vacuum. They were there every day, helping me sort through Rosemary's things, managing the house staff, simplifying my life. I was too tired to fight back. I didn't see the way Vance looked at the silver, or the way Serafina began to talk about the Greenwich house as if it were already a listing in her portfolio. "Dad, you're getting so forgetful," she started saying about 3 years ago. It began with little things. A misplaced set of keys that I'm certain were on the hook 5 minutes prior. A missed appointment that I never remembered making. A dinner reservation for 6 when I was sure I'd said 4. At the time, I thought it was just the fog of age and loss. Now, as I gripped the steering wheel and watched the dark pines of the Berkshires blur past, I realized it was the rehearsal. They had been gaslighting me for years, laying the psychological groundwork for the very petition that sat on Teddy's desk. They weren't just waiting for me to fail. They were actively sabotaging the structural integrity of my mind. I reached the old summer house at Ba, Hung Am. It was a modest place compared to the Greenwich estate, a stone and timber lodge overlooking a black, mirror-still lake. Rosemary and I had bought it with the first big commission I'd ever earned. It was our sanctuary, the one place where the Harrison name didn't have to carry the weight of expectations. The air inside was cold and smelled of cedar and wood smoke from a fire that had gone out years ago. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the darkness, my feet knowing the path by heart, until I reached the massive stone fireplace in the great room. "Look in the ash box," Rosemary had said. The ash box was a small, cast-iron door built into the side of the hearth, used for clearing out debris. I knelt on the cold stone, my joints protesting, and pulled the rusted handle. It ground, a sound like a dying bird. Inside, buried under a layer of gray dust and ancient soot, was a small, fireproof metal box. I pulled it out and sat on the floor, my heart drumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My hands were covered in ash, but I didn't care. I felt like a man digging up a grave. The box wasn't locked. Rosemary knew I would find it when the time was right. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger and a small, silver USB drive. I opened the ledger first. It wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous record of every cent I'd ever given Serafina and Vance. But it was more than that. Rosemary had been a private investigator before we married, a fact. Serafina had forgotten, and Vance had never known. The ledger contained notes in her elegant, slopping script. November, Muy Bornth. Vance requested Num Muy, $2 for marketing. Found no record of a marketing firm. Followed him to the Mohegan Sun. He lost Born Muy $2 at the Baccarat table in 3 hours. March Hained. Serafina lied about the property taxes on the North Ridge house. She used the gift money to pay off Vance's private creditors. The man he owes is Silas Vane, not a banker. An enforcer. My breath hitched. Silas Vane. I knew that name. He was a shadow in the New England underworld, a man who dealt in high-interest, predatory loans for the elite who couldn't go to a traditional bank. If Vance was in debt to Vane, he wasn't just drowning, he was a dead man walking. I flipped toward the back of the ledger. The entries grew more desperate as Rosemary's health declined. August Muy 8th. They think I'm sleeping. I heard them in the hallway. Vance told Serafina that the Greenwich house is worth $12 million on its own. He said, "If the old man won't leave, we'll have to make him leave." Serafina didn't argue. She just asked how long it would take to file the paperwork. A hot, searing pain flared in my chest. My daughter. My little girl had been plotting my displacement while her mother was dying in the next room. The betrayal was so total, so absolute, that for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt the foundations of my world finally give way. But then, I saw a final note, scribbled on a loose scrap of paper at the very back. "Sterling, if you are reading this, they have made their move. Don't fight them with logic. They have already decided you are illogical. Fight them with the truth they think they buried." The USB drive contains the recordings from the nursery monitor I kept in the study. I never told them I kept it active. It catches everything. Look at the file labeled "The Night of the Falling Star." I stood up, the ledger clutched to my chest. I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. The grief was still there, but it was being paved over by something much stronger, a cold, engineering focus. They wanted to declare me incompetent. They wanted to take my house and my dignity to pay off a debt to a thug. I walked to the kitchen, plugged the USB drive into my laptop, and waited for the screen to flicker to life. The file, "The Night of the Falling Star," was dated 2 weeks before Rosemary passed. The video was grainy, a night vision green, but the audio was crystal clear. It showed my study. I was asleep in the armchair, exhausted from a day at the hospital. Serafina and Vance entered the room. They weren't there to check on me. I watched as Vance walked over to my desk and began systematically going through my private files. I watched as Serafina stood by the window, her back to me, her voice cold and devoid of the golden girl warmth I'd known my whole life. "We need the power of attorney, Vance," she said. "The doctor said he could last another decade. We don't have a decade. Silas is calling the debt in June." "I'll get it," Vance whispered, his hands moving through my drawers with practiced ease. "The hired gun Thorne is already on board. He just needs a few more incidents to justify the emergency filing. I've been swapping his blood pressure meds with a low-dose sedative. He'll be groggy, confused, and paranoid within a month. I felt the blood drain from my face. They hadn't just been gaslighting me. They had been drugging me. I watched the screen as Vance found what he was looking for: my signature stamp. He used it on a document I couldn't see, then tucked the paper into his jacket. He turned toward the camera, and for a split second, his face was illuminated by a flash of lightning from the storm outside. He looked like a wolf that had finally found the throat of the sheep. "He'll never know what hit him," Vance said. "He's my father, Vance," Serafina said, her voice finally showing a flicker of something, but it wasn't remorse. It was calculation. "Make sure the facility is top tier. I don't want him suffering. I just want him out of the way." I closed the laptop. The silence of the summer house was absolute. I wasn't the man I was 3 hours ago. I wasn't a grieving widower or a confused father. I was a man who had built structures meant to last a century, and I had just found the detonator my enemies had hidden in my own basement. They thought they had 48 hours to finish me. They didn't realize that I now had 48 hours to dismantle their lives. But as I prepared to drive back to the city, I noticed something else in the metal box. Beneath the ledger, there was a small, sealed envelope addressed to Vance Montgomery. It was thick, heavy, and the wax seal was unbroken. Rosemary hadn't just kept a record of his debts. She had kept something he was willing to kill for. And as I broke the seal, I realized the war hadn't even truly begun. I drove back toward Greenwich through the gray, pre-dawn light, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. Every time I blinked, I saw the grainy, night vision footage of Serafina standing by my window, casually discussing my disposal as if she were deciding where to move an old piece of furniture. The Golden Girl. The daughter I had carried on my shoulders through the surf at Martha's Vineyard. The child I'd stayed up with for 3 nights straight when she had pneumonia at age 10, whispering that she was going to be fine because I'd never let anything happen to her. I'd spent my life building structures to keep the rain out, and I hadn't noticed the rot eating away at the very heart of my home. But the most chilling part wasn't the theft. It was the low-dose sedative. I thought back to the last 6 months, the morning fog that never quite lifted. The way my heart would suddenly race for no reason. The subtle tremors in my hands that Vance would always point out with a look of mock pity. "Careful there, Sterling. You're looking a bit unsteady today. Maybe let me handle the car keys?" He wasn't being helpful. He was poisoning me. He was literally manufacturing the evidence he needed to present to a judge. I felt a surge of nausea that had nothing to do with the drugs and everything to do with the envelope sitting on the passenger seat. I hadn't opened it yet. I wanted to be in a safe place, a place with light and locks, before I peered into whatever darkness Rosemary had saved for the very end. I pulled into a diner on the outskirts of Stamford, a place where no one would recognize a Harrison, and slid into a back booth. My hands were finally steady. The anger was acting as a powerful stimulant, burning through the remnants of whatever they'd been slipping into my coffee. I tore the wax seal of the envelope. Inside was a folder of documents and 3 photographs. The first was a mugshot from a precinct in South Carolina, dated 15 years ago. The man in the photo was younger, his hair darker and his eyes more desperate, but the smirk was unmistakable. It was Vance. But the name on the booking sheet wasn't Vance Montgomery, it was Curtis Vane. The second document was a birth certificate for Curtis Vane, born to a mother who worked as a domestic in a trailer park outside of Charleston. No father listed. The third was a copy of a marriage license between Curtis Vane and a woman named Jolene Blackwood. There was no record of a divorce. The Montgomery name, the old money Virginia pedigree, the prestigious consulting firm, it was all a fabrication. My daughter hadn't just married a gambler. She had married a ghost. A grifter who shared a last name with Silas Vane, the very man who was now coming to collect his pound of flesh. I didn't know it yet, but the connection between Vance and Silas wasn't just business. It was blood. What happened next was a blur of calculated moves. I called Teddy Beaumont from a burner phone I'd picked up at a gas station. "Teddy," I said, my voice low, "I have everything. I have the motive. I have the evidence of the drugging, and I have the real identity of the man in my daughter's bed." "Sterling, thank God," Teddy exhaled. "But listen, you need to get to a doctor, a real one. If they've been sedating you, we need a blood panel before the chemicals clear your system. If we can prove they've been tampering with your health, the conservatorship isn't just dead, it becomes a criminal case." "No," I said, a dark plan beginning to take shape. "If I go to the hospital now, they'll know I've caught on. They'll vanish, or worse, they'll get desperate and do something to Julian. I need to keep the performance going for 24 more hours. I need them to think the confused old man is exactly where they want him." "Sterling," That's incredibly dangerous, Teddy warned. If they up the dose because you're acting erratic— I'm an engineer, Teddy, I interrupted. I know how to manage a controlled collapse. I'm going home. I'm going to drink the coffee. I'm going to stumble, and I'm going to let them think they've already won. I arrived back at the Greenwich estate at by home a.m. As I pulled into the drive, I saw Vance's black Range Rover parked near the front door. He was waiting for me. I took a deep breath, slumped my shoulders, and let my expression go slightly vacant. I practiced the look in the rearview mirror, the hollow, searching gaze of a man who couldn't remember why he'd left the house in the middle of the night. I walked through the front door, and Vance was there in an instant, his face a mask of deep concern. Sterling, my God, where have you been? He rushed forward, grabbing my arm with a grip that was a little too firm. Serafina has been frantic. She thought you'd wandered off into the woods. You had us terrified, man. I just wanted to see the lake, I stammered, letting my voice crack. The lake at the old house. Rosemary liked the lake. Vance's eyes searched mine, looking for a trap, but all he saw was a man who looked like he'd spent the night talking to a ghost. The lake? Sterling? That's a 3-hour drive? You don't even remember driving there, do you? I don't know, I said, rubbing my temples. It's all a bit gray, Vance. My head feels like it's full of wool. I know, he cooed, leading me toward the kitchen. It's the stress. You've been doing too much. Come on, sit down. Serafina's making you some of that special herbal tea you like. It'll help clear the cobwebs. I sat at the kitchen table. Serafina was there, her back to me, pouring steaming water into a porcelain cup. She didn't turn around immediately. When she did, her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. It was a beautiful performance. Oh, Dad, she whispered, kneeling beside my chair. You can't do this to us. You can't just disappear. What if you'd had an accident? What if you'd forgotten how to get home? I'm sorry, honey, I said, patting her hand with a trembling finger. I missed your mother. I know, she said, sliding the tea toward me. Drink this. It's got honey and lemon. It'll help you rest. I watched her face as I picked up the cup. She was my daughter. She had her mother's chin and my eyes, and she was watching me drink poison with a smile on her face. I brought the cup to my lips, letting the steam rise into my face. I didn't drink. I made a slurping sound, then set the cup down, feigning a sudden coughing fit. It's a bit hot, I wheezed. Give me a minute. Take your time, Sterling, Vance said, leaning against the counter. He checked his watch. We have that appointment at 10. Remember? With Dr. Thorne? He's just coming by for a friendly chat. Just to make sure we're managing your episodes correctly. A doctor? I asked, acting confused. Why do I need a doctor? Because we love you, Dad, Serafina said, her voice dropping to that melodic, terrifying sweetness. And we want to make sure you stay with us for a long, long time. I spent the next 2 hours in my study, pretending to doze while they hovered in the hallway, whispering. I could hear snippets of their conversation through the heavy oak door. Is he out? Vance whispered. Almost, Serafina replied. He's barely keeping his eyes open. Thorne will be here in 20 minutes. This is it, Vance. Once the report is signed, the judge will grant the emergency order. We can have the North Ridge debt settled by Friday. And the Greenwich house? Vance asked. The listing is already drafted, she said. 12 million, Vance. We'll never have to worry about Silas again. I sat in the darkness, my eyes wide open, staring at the blueprints on my desk. I wasn't looking at bridges anymore. I was looking at the exact coordinates of their destruction. At 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. Doctor. Sterling Thorne was exactly what Teddy had described. A hired gun. He was a man of 60, with silver hair, a tan that screamed of Florida golf courses, and an expensive suit that he wore like armor. He carried a leather-bound folio and a smile that felt like a surgical strike. Mr. Harrison, he said, shaking my hand. It's an honor. I've admired your work on the Sterling Harrison Tower for years, a masterpiece of structural integrity. Thank you, I said, letting my head loll slightly to the side. I remember that one. It was tall. Thorne's eyes twinkled with a predatory gleam. He glanced at Serafina, who gave him a sharp, imperceptible nod. Why don't we sit, Sterling? Thorne suggested. I'd just like to ask you a few simple questions. Just a little chat between two men who appreciate fine architecture. We sat in the living room. Vance stood by the fireplace, a silent sentry. Serafina sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap. The stage was set. Thorn began with the basics: dates, names, places. I fumbled them all with a practiced, agonizing slow-motion grace. I called Serafina Rosemary twice. I told him the year was High in Lermuitarm. I watched as Thorn's pen flew across his notepad, recording every failure. "And your finances, Sterling?" Thorn asked, his voice oily. "Serafina tells me you've been making some unusual gifts. Large sums of cash to strangers?" "Oh, the people in the park," I said, nodding vaguely. "They looked hungry. Everyone should have a bridge, don't you think?" A bridge to a better place. Vance let out a quiet, performative sigh. Serafina dabbed at her eyes. Thorn leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Sterling, do you sometimes feel like people are watching you? Like maybe your own family is trying to hurt you?" This was the trap. If I said yes, I was paranoid. If I said no, I was oblivious. I looked at Thorn, and for a second, just a second, I let the mask slip. I let him see the razor-sharp clarity in my eyes. I leaned in until our faces were inches apart. "I don't think they're watching me, Doctor," I whispered. "I know they are. Just like I know how much Curtis Vane paid you to be here today." The blood drained from Thorn's face. The pen in his hand stopped mid-stroke. The silence in the room became a physical vacuum, sucking the air out of the lungs of everyone present. "What did you just say?" Vance barked, stepping forward from the fireplace. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes locked on Thorn. I asked if the retainer from Curtis was enough to cover the malpractice suit that's coming, Sterling. "Because I have a feeling your Board of Ethics is going to be very interested in why a forensic psychiatrist is helping a South Carolina grifter drug a decorated war veteran." Serafina stood up, her face white. "Dad? What are you talking about? You're having a breakdown. Vance, call the ambulance." "Sit down, Serafina," I said, my voice returning to its full, booming authority. I stood up, my posture straight, the confused old man vanishing as if he'd never existed. "And Vance? If you move toward that phone, I'll have Silas Vane on the line before you can dial the first digit. I think he'd be very interested to know you've been planning to skip town with the house money." Vance froze. The name Silas Vane hit him like a physical blow. He looked at me, then at the folder I'd pulled from behind the sofa cushion. "You don't have anything," Vance sneered, though his voice was shaking. "You're an old man with a head full of sedatives. No one is going to believe you." "That's where you're wrong, Curtis," I said, opening the folder to show the South Carolina mugshot. "I'm not the one who needs to be believed. You are." What happened next changed everything. The front door didn't just open. It was kicked. 4 men in dark suits stepped into the foyer, and the man leading them wasn't a doctor or a lawyer. He was a mountain of a man with a scared throat and eyes that had seen the bottom of the world. Silas Vane had arrived, and he wasn't looking for me. "Curtis," Silas said, his voice a gravelly rumble that shook the chandelier. "I heard you were looking for a bridge. I think it's time we discussed the toll." I looked at my daughter, who was shrinking against the wall. This was the moment I realized the golden girl hadn't just betrayed me. She had let a wolf into our home, and the wolf was finally hungry. The silence that followed Silas Vane's entrance was heavier than the gray October sky. It was the kind of silence you find at a construction site right before a controlled demolition, the air charged with static, the world holding its breath for the first crack of lightning. Silas didn't move. He stood in the center of the foyer, his men fanning out behind him like shadows detached from their owners. He didn't look like a debt collector. He looked like a judge, delivering a final sentence. His coat was black wool, expensive but worn, and his eyes cold, slate-gray pits were fixed squarely on the man I knew as Vance Montgomery. Vance, or rather Curtis Vane, looked like a structure whose load-bearing walls had just vanished. He was trembling so violently that the glass of water on the side table rattled. His old money, swagger had evaporated, replaced by the raw, shivering terror of a stray dog cornered by its master. "Silas," Vance stammered, his voice 2 octaves higher than I'd ever heard it. "You're early. We had an agreement. The hearing is tomorrow. The paperwork is almost done." Silas didn't answer him. Instead, he turned his gaze to me. For a long, agonizing moment, he looked me up and down, assessing the confused old man I had been pretending to be. Then, a slow, predatory grin spread across his face. "So this is the great Sterling Harrison," Silas rumbled. His voice was like grinding gravel. "The man who builds bridges. I've heard about you, Sterling. You built things to last. It's a shame you didn't build your daughter with the same quality materials." I stood my ground, my spine straight, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. The materials were fine, Silas. It's the rot that was introduced later that compromised the structure. I looked at Vance, starting with your brother. The room went icy. Serafina let out a sharp, choked gasp, her eyes darting between Vance and Silas. "Brother?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Vance. What is he talking about?" Vance didn't look at her. He couldn't. "Tell her, Curtis," Silas said, stepping further into the living room, his men following in a synchronized, menacing rhythm. "Tell your beautiful, old money wife who you really are. Tell her about the trailer in Charleston. Tell her about the bridge you promised to build her out of her father's bones." "Vance, tell him he's lying," Serafina screamed, reaching for her husband's arm. But Vance flinched away from her touch, as if she were made of fire. He collapsed into the armchair, the very one Dr. Thorne had used for his evaluation, and buried his face in his hands. "I had to, Serafina," he moaned. "I owed him. I've always owed him. He's my brother. He bankrolled the Vance Montgomery persona. Every suit, every dinner, every lie. It was his investment." I watched my daughter's face as her world imploded. It was a terrifying thing to witness the moment a person realizes their entire life is a fiction. The North Ridge estate, the consulting career, the man she shared a bed with, it was all a stage set provided by a mobster. "The yacht, too?" she asked, her voice sounding small and hollow, like a child's. "The yacht was supposed to be the exit," Silas interrupted, leaning against the mahogany mantel. $1.5 million. A nice, clean way to wash the money and get Curtis out of my hair. She's not. The money has to come from somewhere, doesn't it, Sterling? And it seems your house is the only bank left with the vault open. I felt the anger rising in me, a hot, structural fire. "The house isn't for sale, Silas, and neither is my sanity. You've been played by a small-time grifter who's too stupid to realize that I've known about this for hours." Silas raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "Is that so? And what does a retired engineer do when he finds a wolf in his kitchen?" "He doesn't fight the wolf," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal tone. "He locks the cage." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, black remote, the one Teddy had given me. I pressed the button. A low, electronic hum filled the house. From the corners of the ceiling, hidden panels slid back, and high-definition security cameras, commercial-grade units I'd had installed months ago under the guise of home security upgrades, whirred into life. In the study, I knew my laptop was currently streaming the entire scene to a secure server at Teddy's firm, and to a secondary location I'd established at the Greenwich Police Precinct. "This house is a fortress, Silas," I said, the engineer in me taking full control. "Every word spoken in this room for the last 24 hours has been recorded. Every conversation between Serafina and Vance about drugging me. Every lie Dr. Thorne just wrote in his folio. And now, your arrival. Your admission of the debt. Your threats." I looked at Dr. Thorne, who was currently trying to blend into the wallpaper. "You might want to put that pen down, Doctor. Unless you want to add conspiracy to commit elder abuse to your report." Thorne dropped the folio as if it were a live grenade. "You think cameras scare me, old man?" Silas laughed, though the sound was hollow. "I've been on camera my whole life. I'll be out of this house and halfway to the city before your lawyer can even find the save button." "That's the thing about foundations, Silas," I said, stepping toward him. "You have to know what's buried underneath them. You think you're here for $1.5 million? You're thinking too small. You're thinking like a thug. I'm thinking like a man who spent 40 years looking at the secrets hidden in the dirt." I pulled out the folder Rosemary had left for me. Not the mugshots, the other one. The one with the real estate records from 30 years ago. 30 years ago, I said, my voice echoing in the foyer. "Your father, Silas, owned a construction firm. He did the grading for the original Harrison Tower. He also did some private work for a developer out in the Jersey marshes. Work that involved a lot of concrete being poured in the middle of the night." Silas's smirk vanished. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine apprehension in him. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the structural integrity of your family's legacy," I said. "My wife, Rosemary, wasn't just a private investigator. She was a historian of the city's sins. She knew that the concrete poured in Chinwisar wasn't just filled with rebar, it was filled with evidence. Evidence that would link your father and you to the disappearance of a certain labor union boss, whose name is still on the FBI's most wanted list. I didn't know if it was true, not yet, but I knew the names in the ledger, and I knew the way Silas's father had retired to Florida. In engineering, if a bridge looks like it's going to collapse, you assume the worst-case scenario. I have the coordinates, Silas. I lied, my voice steady and unwavering. Rosemary left them for me. They're in a safe deposit box at Bank of America. A box that requires my thumbprint and a specific key to open. If I don't check in with my attorney every 6 hours, that box is automatically opened by the district attorney's office. The air in the room was sucked out. Silas looked at his men, then back at me. He was calculating the risk, weighing the $1 million yacht against a life sentence for a 30-year-old murder. You're bluffing, Silas hissed. Try me, I said. But ask yourself this. Why did Rosemary leave that box in my name? Why did she keep it a secret for 5 years? Because she knew that one day, Curtis would come home. She knew the rot would try to find its way back into the house. I turned to my daughter. She was staring at me as if I were a stranger. And in a way, I was. I was the man she had tried to erase, the father she had tried to manage into a nursing home. Serafina, I said, my voice softening just a fraction. You had a choice. You could have come to me. You could have told me you were in trouble. You could have asked for help. Instead, you chose to poison the man who built your world. Dad, I didn't know about Silas, she sobbed, her hands covering her face. I thought Vance he just needed a win. I didn't mean to hurt you. But you did, I said. You hurt me more than any debt ever could. You made me look at my own child and see a structural failure. And as an engineer, there's only one thing you do with a failure that significant. What? She whispered, looking up through tear-streaked eyes. You clear the site, I said. You tear it down and start over. What happened next was a blur of motion. Silas, realizing the game had changed, grabbed Vance by the collar of his expensive Italian suit and hauled him toward the door. We're leaving, Silas growled. But Sterling, don't think this is over. If that box ever opens, if a single word of what you said is true, there isn't enough concrete in this state to hide what I'll do to you. The box is already being watched, Silas, I said. And so are you. Get out of my house. They left. The front door slammed with a finality that shook the windows. Dr. Thorne scrambled out after them, leaving his leather folio on the floor like a discarded skin. The house was suddenly quiet. It was just me and Serafina in the wreckage of our family. She stood in the center of the foyer, her designer dress rumpled, her face a mask of grief and shame. Dad? She asked, reaching out a hand. What? What happens now? I looked at her. I looked at the girl I had loved more than life itself. And then I looked at the empty cup of special tea sitting on the kitchen counter. Now, I said, my voice cold and distant. You pack your things. You have 1 hour. After that, I'm changing the locks. And Serafina, don't bother calling the North Ridge estate. I've already contacted the bank. Since I provided the down payment under fraudulent pretenses, the house is being seized by the trust. You can't, she gasped. Where am I supposed to go? You have a husband, I said, turning my back on her. Go find him. I hear he's looking for a bridge to sleep under. I walked into my study and closed the door. I sat at my desk and pulled the small silver key from the Bank of America envelope. I hadn't been to the box yet. I didn't even know if there were coordinates. I had played the greatest bluff of my life. But as I sat there, the adrenaline fading into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the secure server. Recording complete. File uploaded. And then, a second notification. A text from Teddy. Sterling, I've just looked at the preliminary files from the Bank of America box. Your wife was more thorough than we imagined. It's not just Silas. It's the trust itself. There's a clause Rosemary added 6 months before she died. A moral turpitude clause. I frowned. What does it say, Teddy? It says that if Serafina is ever found to be acting against your well-being, her entire inheritance, every cent of the $40 million estate, is forfeited. Not to a charity, Sterling. To a second beneficiary. My heart stopped. Who? Who is the second beneficiary? Teddy's voice was a whisper over the line. Sterling, it's not a person. It's a trust for a son you never knew you had. I dropped the phone. The floor seemed to vanish beneath my feet. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal I had just survived was only the first floor of a much deeper, much darker tower of lies. And the man who held the keys to the next level was currently standing on my front porch. The phone didn't just hit the Persian rug. It felt like the weight of my entire 74 years had finally snapped the floorboards beneath me. The screen was still glowing, Teddy's text shimmering like a neon warning sign. A son, a second beneficiary, a secret my wife had carried to her grave, tucked away in a Bank of America vault while she smiled at me over morning coffee. The doorbell rang again. It wasn't the frantic, heavy pounding of Silas Vane or the slick, rhythmic tap of a grifter like Vance. It was 3 solid, measured strikes. The sound of a man who knew he had every right to be standing on that porch. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't call Teddy back. I walked to the front door, my legs feeling like they were made of the very silt I'd feared earlier. I pulled the heavy oak door open. The man standing there was in his early 30s. He wore a canvas work jacket, dark jeans, and boots that had seen real dirt, not the manicured mulch of a Greenwich estate. He had a shock of dark hair and a jawline that felt eerily familiar, but it was the eyes that stopped my heart. They were gray, not the cold, slate gray of Silas Vane, but the clear, stormy gray I saw every morning when I looked in the shaving mirror. My eyes. "Sterling Harrison?" he asked. His voice was deep, steady, and lacked even a hint of the performative charm I'd grown used to in this house. I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My name is Gabriel Miller," he said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope identical to the cream-colored one Rosemary had left in the safe deposit box. "I think we have a lot to talk about. A woman named Rosemary told me to come here if I ever saw your name in the legal notices of the New York Times. I didn't know it yet, but the foundation I'd spent the last hour trying to save was already gone. I was standing on a new site entirely. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. As Gabrielle stepped into the foyer, Serafina appeared at the top of the stairs. She was carrying a designer suitcase, her eyes red and puffy, the mask of the Golden Girl completely shattered. She stopped dead when she saw Gabrielle. She looked at him, then at me, then back at him. The resemblance was so striking it was like looking at a ghost of my younger self. "Who is this, Dad?" she snapped, her voice trembling with a cocktail of fear and remaining arrogance. "Is this another one of your detectives?" "I told you, I'm leaving. You don't have to keep insulting me." "This isn't a detective, Serafina," I said, my gaze never leaving Gabrielle. "This is Gabriel." Gabrielle looked up at her. There was no malice in his expression, only a profound, weary kind of pity. "You must be Serafina," he said. "I've heard a lot about you, mostly about how much you were loved." "I don't care what you've heard," she screamed, dropping her suitcase at the top of the stairs. It tumbled down the steps, the heavy thuds echoing like gunshots in the quiet house. "Dad, what is happening? Who is this man?" "Sit down, Serafina," I commanded. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of the lead engineer on a collapsing job site. We moved into the study. The room still smelled of Dr. Thorne's expensive cologne and the metallic tang of the adrenaline that had filled the air during the confrontation with Silas. Gabriel sat in the guest chair, the one where the hired gun had tried to dismantle my mind. He looked perfectly at home. "I grew up in a town called Garrett, Pennsylvania," Gabriel began, his hands resting flat on his knees. They were the hands of a builder, scared, sturdy, capable. "My mother was Sarah Miller. She was a waitress at a diner near the construction site of the Allegheny Bridge back in the late 80s. The name hit me like a physical blow. Sarah. I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was 35 again, standing in the mud of a Pennsylvania riverbank, exhausted and covered in concrete dust. Sarah had been the light at the end of a very dark, very lonely project. It had been a brief, intense summer romance before I returned to New York to marry Rosemary, the woman my family had already chosen for me. She never told me. I whispered. "She didn't want anything from you," Gabriel said. "She told me you were a good man who had a big life waiting for him, and she didn't want to be the thing that pulled you under. She died when I was 12. I grew up in the system, Sterling. I worked my way through trade school. I build houses now. Real houses. Not monuments. Prison." I felt a tear track through the wrinkles on my cheek. "And Rosemary? How did she find you?" "She found me 10 years ago," Gabriel said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "She was a hell of a woman. She showed up at a job site in Scranton, sat me down, and told me she'd known about me since before she and you were married. She'd intercepted a letter my mother sent. She didn't destroy it. She kept it. She told me she spent 20 years deciding whether to hate me or protect me. In the end, she chose to protect you." I looked at the cream-colored envelope in his hand. My wife, the woman I thought was the silent partner in my life, had been managing a secret dynasty for decades. She had provided Gabriel with the funds for his education, his first business, his home, all under the guise of an anonymous educational trust. She had been balancing the scales behind my back, ensuring that if the Golden Girl ever failed, The Harrison legacy wouldn't die with her. She told me, Gabriel continued, his voice dropping, that if the day ever came when the people around you tried to turn your own mind into a weapon against you, I was to come here. She said I was the structural reinforcement you were going to need. Serafina, who had been hovering in the doorway, let out a hysterical, jagged laugh. Structural reinforcement? He's a bastard. That's what he is. You're going to give him my inheritance? Because of a moral turpitude clause? Dad, you can't be serious. I'm your daughter. I'm the one who was here. You were here to drug me, Serafina. I roared, standing up so fast my chair hit the bookshelves. You were here to sell the roof over my head to pay for a yacht for a man who isn't even who he says he is. You didn't love me. You loved the Sterling Harrison brand. Gabriel is the only person in this room who hasn't asked me for a single cent today. I don't want the money, Sterling, Gabriel said, standing up to meet my gaze. I didn't come here for $40 million. I have a life. I have a wife and a daughter of my own. I came here because Rosemary told me you were going to be alone when the dust settled. And no man should have to stand in the ruins of his life by himself. I really looked at him, and I saw the man I could have been if I hadn't been so obsessed with the height of my towers. But the escalation wasn't over. The betrayal had one more floor to reveal. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Teddy. I answered it on speaker. Sterling, I'm at the precinct, Teddy said, his voice sounding hollow and terrified. We have a problem. A major problem. Silas Vane and Vance Curtis, they never made it to the city. What are you talking about, Teddy? The police found the Range Rover flipped in a ravine 3 miles from your house. It was a professional job, Sterling. The brake lines were cut. Perfectly. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. I looked at Serafina. Her face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. The brake lines? I whispered. I looked at Gabriel, then back at the phone. Who would do that? That's not the part that's going to kill you, Sterling, Teddy said, his voice trembling. The dashcam in the Range Rover was still running. It captured the last few minutes of their conversation. Vance was screaming at Silas, telling him he was going to turn state's evidence. But Silas was laughing. He told Vance that he wasn't the one who ordered the hit on you. He said he was just the muscle. Then who? I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. Silas said the Golden Girl was the one who called him 6 months ago, Teddy said. She didn't just want you declared incompetent, Sterling. She told Silas that if the conservatorship failed, she wanted you removed permanently. She'd already signed over the life insurance policy to him as a down payment. The room went cold, not the cold of an October rain, but the absolute zero of the void. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had carried, the girl I had built a world for. Serafina didn't deny it. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me with a flat, dead stare, the stare of a predator that had finally been caught in its own trap. You were never going to give it up, Dad, she said, her voice eerily calm. The house, the money, the control. You were going to live to be 100 just to spite me. Vance was weak. He wanted to play games with doctors. I wanted it to be over. I wanted my life to start. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Gabriel. His grip was firm, grounding, the only thing keeping me from collapsing into the abyss. I'm sorry, Sterling, he whispered. But as Serafina reached into her handbag, not for a phone, not for a tissue, but with a sudden, violent desperation, I realized that the Golden Girl wasn't finished with the demolition. If I don't get the legacy, she hissed, pulling out a small, snub-nosed revolver I recognized from the safe in the library, one she must have swiped weeks ago, then no one does. Not the old man, and certainly not the bastard. She leveled the gun at Gabriel's chest. Serafina, don't! I screamed. But the real shock wasn't the gun. The real shock was the sound of the back door of the study swinging open, and the voice that came from the shadows, a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. Put the gun down, Serafina. You always were a terrible shot. I turned, my breath hitching in my throat. Standing in the doorway, pale and thin but unmistakably alive, was Rosemary. The foundations didn't just break then. The entire world upside down. The air in the room didn't just get cold. It turned to glass, fragile and sharp enough to draw blood with every breath. I stared at the woman standing in the doorway. She was thinner than I remembered, her hair a snowy white where it used to be the color of toasted almonds, but those eyes, the deep, knowing violet of the woman I'd loved for half a century, were unmistakable. Rosemary. My heart gave a sickening, erratic thud, like a bird hitting a window pane. I wanted to reach out, to touch her, to see if my hand would pass through her like mist, but I couldn't move. I was a man who had built bridges to span miles of open water, yet I couldn't cross the 10 feet of hardwood between us. Serafina's reaction was more violent. The revolver in her hand didn't drop, it shook. She let out a sound that wasn't a scream or a sob, but a high-pitched, keening whine of pure, unadulterated terror. To her, this wasn't a miracle. It was a haunting. "You're dead," Serafina hissed, her voice cracking. "I saw the casket. I saw the dirt. I felt the pulse stop." "You're dead. You felt what you wanted to feel, Serafina," Rosemary said, her voice steady and echoing with a gravitas that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. She stepped forward, ignoring the gun pointed at her chest. She walked with a slight limp I didn't recognize, her gaze fixed entirely on her daughter. "You were so eager to see me gone that you didn't even notice when Teddy and I swapped the toxicology reports. You didn't notice that the hospice nurse who took my vitals that last night was a woman I'd known since my days on the force." I looked at Teddy, who was still on the speakerphone, the line silent but active. I realized then that my oldest friend hadn't just been my lawyer. He'd been the architect of a 5-year-long ghost story. "Sterling," Rosemary said, finally turning her eyes to mine. The hardness in them softened for a split second, a flash of the woman who used to tuck me in when I worked too late. "I am so sorry. I had to leave. If I had stayed, she would have finished what she started with me, and then she would have come for you immediately. I had to become a ghost to keep the wolf at bay. You let me grieve for 5 years," I whispered, the weight of 1,000 lonely nights crashing down on me. "I sat by that grave every Sunday, Rosemary. I talked to a headstone. I was there, Sterling," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "I was in the car across the road, every single Sunday. But the play wasn't finished. I had to wait for the emergency. I had to wait for her to show her hand so completely that there would be no way for her to ever crawl back into the light." Serafina let out a jagged, hysterical laugh, her finger tightening on the trigger. "So this was the grand plan? A 5-year hide-and-seek? It doesn't matter. None of it matters. I have the gun. I have the signed power of attorney from the doctor's visit. I have the legal right to this house." "No, you don't," Rosemary said, reaching into the pocket of her sensible wool coat. She pulled out a sheet of paper, the original version of the moral turpitude clause Teddy had mentioned. "The moment you conspired with Silas Vane to have your father removed, you triggered a total forfeiture. But there's a second part to that clause, Serafina. A part your mother wrote specifically for a daughter she knew was broken beyond repair." Rosemary looked at the gun, then back at Serafina's eyes. "I didn't just fake my death to protect Sterling. I did it to see if you could be saved. I left you the North Ridge house. I left you $1 million in a separate trust. I gave you every opportunity to be a daughter, to be a mother to Julian, to be a human being. And you used every cent to buy a monster like Vance and a hitman like Silas. I deserved more." Serafina screamed. "I'm a Montgomery. I'm a Harrison. I was supposed to be the queen of this city, not a nursemaid for an old man who cares more about steel beams than his own blood." "You aren't a Harrison," I said, my voice rising from the depths of my chest. I looked at Gabriel, who was standing beside me, a silent, steady pillar. "You might have the name, but you don't have the foundation. You're a hollow structure, Serafina." And hollow structures collapse. The front door burst open then, not with a kick, but with the professional efficiency of the Greenwich Police Department. I hadn't called them. Teddy hadn't called them. Rosemary had. 6 officers flooded the foyer, their weapons drawn. The lead detective, a man I'd seen at Rosemary's funeral, stepped into the study. "Drop the weapon, Mrs. Montgomery," he commanded. Serafina looked at the police, then at her dead mother, then at me. The realization finally hit her, the total, crushing weight of the reversal. She wasn't the predator anymore. She was the evidence. She didn't drop the gun. She lowered it slowly, her face going slack as the adrenaline finally burned out, leaving only the cold, gray ash of her failure. "He drugged me too," she whispered, a final, pathetic attempt at a lie. "Vance. He made me do it." "We have the tapes, Serafina," the detective said, stepping forward to cuff her. "We have the recordings from the nursery monitor. We have your phone records with Silas Vane. And we have the doctor, Thorne. He's already singing like a bird at the precinct." As they led her away, she didn't look back. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just walked out of the house she had tried to steal, leaving a trail of designer perfume and broken lives behind her. I stood in the center of my study, the silence returning like a heavy shroud. Gabrielle was still there. Rosemary was still there. The three of us stood in a triangle of secrets and bloodlines. "Sterling," Rosemary said, taking a step toward me. I held up a hand. My mind was reeling, recalculating the load of my entire life. 5 years, Rosemary. You let me believe I was alone. I knew Teddy was watching you, she said softly. I knew Gabriel was waiting. I had to be sure, Sterling. I had to be sure she was gone for good. If I had come back a year ago, she would have just played the victim. She would have waited. I had to let her go to the very edge. I looked at Gabriel. "And you? You knew she was alive?" Gabriel shook his head. "No. I knew a woman was funding my life. I knew she was the one who told me to wait. I didn't know she was the one standing in the doorway until 5 minutes ago." I felt a strange, cold clarity. The betrayal of my daughter was a tragedy. The betrayal of my wife. That was a renovation. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a facade. Rosemary wasn't the quiet, supportive wife. She was the foreman. She had been running the job site while I was busy looking at the sky. "What now?" I asked, looking around the room. The blueprints on my desk were covered in dust. The Sterling Harrison name felt like a weight I no longer wanted to carry. "Now," Rosemary said, her voice firm, "we finished the demolition. Silas Vane's organization is being dismantled as we speak. The Northridge house is gone. The yacht is at the bottom of a legal harbor. But there's one more thing, Sterling. One more secret that wasn't in the Bank of America box." I let out a weary sigh. "How many more floors are there to this building, Rosemary?" "Just the basement," she said. She walked over to the safe in the wall, the one Serafina had looted. She didn't use the combination. She reached behind the mahogany molding and pressed a hidden release. A small, velvet-lined drawer popped out. Inside was a single, blackened key and a map of the Greenwich estate. "The money Serafina was looking for?" Rosemary asked. "The 40 million? It isn't in the stocks, Sterling. It isn't in the bonds. I moved it all into physical assets years ago, before I died. I knew she'd try to freeze the accounts. I knew she'd try to audit you." She pointed to a spot on the map, deep in the woods behind the old summer house. "Vance didn't just owe Silas money," Rosemary whispered. "He was working for someone else. Someone bigger. Someone who's been trying to get onto this property for 50 years. Someone who thinks, my father, your mentor, buried something under the foundations of the original lodge." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. My mentor, Harrison Sr., the man who had given me my name and my start. What did he bury, Rosemary? "The reason you were chosen, Sterling," she said. "The reason a boy from a construction site in Pennsylvania was suddenly given the keys to a kingdom in Greenwich." I looked at Gabriel, the son I never knew, the man who built houses, not monuments. I realized then that the family revenge wasn't just about Serafina. It was about a cycle of secrets that went back generations. And the only way to stop the collapse was to dig up the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. "Get your coat, Gabriel," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "We're going to the summer house. We're going to find out what kind of ground we're actually standing on." But as we walked toward the door, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a restricted number. I answered it, expecting Teddy or the police. "Sterling Harrison?" A voice rasped. It wasn't Silas. It was older, more refined. A voice I hadn't heard since I was a young man. "I hear the ghost has come home. Tell Rosemary that the basement is already open. And I'm waiting for the two of you to join the party." The line went dead. I looked at Rosemary. Her face was a mask of pure, crystalline fear. "He's back," she whispered. "Who?" I asked. "The man who really built this city," she said. "The man who's been waiting for us to finish each other off so he could take back the bedrock." The war wasn't over. It had just moved from the parlor to the pit, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know if the structure could hold. The drive to the Berkshires was the longest 4 hours of my life. I was behind the wheel of my vintage Mercedes, the leather interior smelling faintly of the pipe tobacco my mentor, Harrison Sr., used to smoke. To my right sat Rosemary, a woman I had mourned for 1,800 nights, her presence in the passenger seat so surreal that I found myself glancing over every few minutes just to ensure she didn't vanish back into the ether. In the back sat Gabriel, the son I hadn't known existed until an hour ago, his silent, watchful gaze mirrored in the rearview. We were a car full of ghosts and strangers, hurtling through a midnight rain toward a reckoning I'd been unknowingly building toward for 40 years. "I didn't do it to hurt you, Sterling," Rosemary said, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tires on the wet pavement. I did it because you were the only part of my life that was still clean. I couldn't let the dirt from the basement touch you. The dirt already touched me, Rosemary, I said, my voice rasping with a bitterness that surprised even me. It touched me when our daughter tried to have me lobotomized. It touched me when I spent 5 years talking to a piece of granite because I thought you were under it. You didn't protect me. You abandoned me to a job site that was already rigged to blow. She didn't argue. She just looked out the window at the dark silhouettes of the passing trees. The silence in the car was a structural weight, a load that no bridge could ever hope to carry. Gabriel, to his credit, didn't say a word. He was the most grounded of all of us. A man who built things with his hands and knew that when a beam is under too much tension, the best thing you can do is give it space. The basement Rosemary had spoken of wasn't just a literal room under the lodge. It was a metaphor for the underworld of Connecticut and New York's elite, a network of builders, politicians, and fixers who had been using the Harrison name as a front for their structural repairs for decades. And the man who had called me? Archibald Kensington. He was the old money kingmaker who had plucked me from that Pennsylvania riverbank 40 years ago. He hadn't seen talent in me. He had seen a blank slate he could draw his own corruption upon. We reached the lake at high, Hong a.m. The summer house sat like a jagged tooth against the obsidian water. The lights were already on warm, golden glows that looked inviting from a distance, but felt like a warning as we drew closer. As we stepped out of the car, the air was sharp with the scent of pine and something else, something chemical. Accelerant. He's already inside, Rosemary whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the small of her back where she'd likely kept a weapon. Stay behind me, Gabriel, I said. I didn't come here to watch, Sterling, Gabriel replied, stepping up beside me. He picked up a heavy iron crowbar from the trunk of the car. You build the plan. I'll handle the demolition. We walked onto the porch. The front door was ajar. Inside, the great room was exactly as I had left it 48 hours ago, with one exception. Sitting in the high-backed wing chair by the fireplace, the chair that had always been mine, was Archibald Kensington. He looked ancient, his skin like yellowed parchment stretched over a skull, but his eyes were as bright and predatory as a hawk's. He held a crystal tumbler of my best scotch in one hand and a blackened, heavy key in the other. Sterling, Archibald rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. And the beautiful Rosemary. I must say, the death suit you. You look quite refreshed for a woman who's been in the ground for 5 years. Archie, I said, my voice cold. I'd ask how you found us, but you've always been good at sniffing out the rot. The rot? Archibald laughed, a dry, wheezing sound. Sterling, I am the rot. And you were my finest masterpiece. The bridge builder, with the heart of gold. Do you have any idea how much money we moved through your firm? How many accidents were covered up by your structural reports? He stood up, his joints popping, and gestured toward the floorboards. Your father-in-law, Harrison Sr. He was a man of vision, Archibald said. He knew that in this city, you don't build on bedrock, you build on secrets. And beneath this lodge, in the vault he built with his own hands, lies the ledger of every sin committed in this state since the war. The real basement. Is that what Vance was after? I asked. The ledger? Vance was a cockroach, Archibald sneered. He was working for Silas, and Silas was working for a group of investors who wanted to use those secrets to leverage a buyout of the waterfront. But Serafina, she was different. She didn't want the secrets, she just wanted the power. She would have burned this whole world down just to see her name in lights. Archibald took a slow, agonizing step toward me. But now she's in a cell, and the ghost has returned, which means the accounts need to be settled. Rosemary, I believe you have something of mine. Rosemary stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a lethal intensity. I have the maps, Archie, and I have the testimony of the men you hired to process the union boss back in Chinmisar. If you think I'm going to hand you the keys to the city just so you can go on playing God, you haven't been paying attention. I don't need the keys, my dear, Archibald whispered. He looked at Gabriel. I just need the legacy to continue. Gabriel, did your mother ever tell you why I sent Sterling to that construction site in Pennsylvania all those years ago? The world seemed to stop spinning. I looked at Gabriel, whose face had gone completely still. What are you saying, Archie? I roared. I'm saying that Sterling wasn't the only one I was watching, Archibald said, his eyes gleaming with a terrible triumph. Sarah Miller was a beautiful girl, but she was also the daughter of a rival of mine. I didn't send Sterling to Pennsylvania to build a bridge. I sent him to infiltrate a family. And when Gabriel was born? Well, I've been funding his Anonymous's trust for 30 years. Not Rosemary. Me. I felt the foundation finally, truly vanish. I looked at Rosemary. She was staring at Archibald with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. "You're lying," she whispered. "I was the one sending the money. I tracked the accounts." "You tracked the accounts I wanted you to track," Archibald cackled. "I've been grooming this boy to take over the Harrison empire since he was in diapers. He's the clean slate, Sterling. He's the one who's going to rebuild the city under my thumb, while you and Rosemary finally retire." He pulled a small, silver remote from his pocket. "The accelerant I mentioned? It's not just in the walls," Archibald said. "It's in the vault. If I press this button, the basement, and everything in it, the ledger, the maps, the evidence turns to ash. And since the local police are on my payroll, the report will say that Sterling Harrison, in a fit of grief-induced insanity, burned his own family to the ground. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the money or the son. It was about the one thing an engineer can never account for, the human heart. "You're not going to press it, Archie," Gabriel said. He stepped forward, the iron crowbar hanging loosely at his side. He didn't look like a builder anymore. He looked like a reaper. "Oh? And why is that, boy?" "Because," Gabriel said, a cold, hard smile touching his lips, "I'm not the clean slate you think I am. You think you've been grooming me? I've been working on your job sites since I was 18. I've seen the way you skimp on the rebar. I've seen the way you bribe the inspectors. And 2 years ago, I didn't just take the money from the trust. I used it to buy the one thing you can't control." "And what's that?" Archibald sneered. "The debt on your primary holding company," Gabriel said. "Vance wasn't the only one drowning, Archie. You've been over-leveraged for 5 years, trying to keep your basement from flooding. I own your house, Archibald. I own your cars. And as of 10 minutes ago, I own the very ground this lodge is standing on." Gabriel pulled a set of papers from his jacket, not the cream-colored ones, but legal briefs from a firm in Philadelphia. "I didn't come here to find a father," Gabriel said, looking at me with an expression of profound, tragic love. "I came here to finish the job Sarah Miller started 30 years ago. I came here to tear down the man who ruined her father's life." Archibald's face went from yellow to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at the remote in his hand, then at Gabriel. You think you can win? I'll blow us all to hell." "Then do it," Gabriel challenged. "But I've already moved the ledger, Archie. Rosemary found it 5 years ago, right before she died. We've been working together this whole time. The vault downstairs? It's empty. It's filled with nothing but old newspapers and a few gallons of gasoline." Rosemary walked over to Gabriel and placed a hand on his shoulder. The two of them stood together, a mother and a son forged in the fires of a 30-year-long war. I was the only one who had been in the dark. I was the bridge that had been used to carry the troops across, only to be left standing alone in the middle of the river. "Sterling," Rosemary said, her voice full of a heartbreaking regret. "I had to let you believe. If you hadn't been the victim, Archibald never would have let his guard down. He needed to see you broken to feel safe." I looked at the three of them, the wife who had faked her death, the son who had been a secret agent of revenge, and the mentor who was now just a dying old man in a borrowed chair. "Get out," I said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of every skyscraper I'd ever built. "Sterling, please," Rosemary started. "Get out," I roared. "All of you. Archie, Gabriel, Rosemary, leave. This is my house. This is my foundation. And I'm going to be the one who decides what happens to it." I walked over to Archibald and snatched the remote from his hand. He was too weak to resist. He slumped back into the chair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Sterling?" Archibald whispered. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the remote. I looked at the maps. I looked at the woman who had lied to me for 5 years and the son who had used me as a pawn. "I'm an engineer," I said, my voice cold and final. "And when a structure is this compromised, there is no repair. You don't patch the cracks. You don't reinforce the beams." I looked them all in the eye, one last time. "You clear the site." I pressed the button. But the explosion didn't happen in the house. It happened 3 miles away, at the Northridge estate, the monument to Serafina's greed and Archibald's influence. The night sky lit up with a brilliant orange flare as the Muihadola Million mansion was leveled to the ground. "The ledger was never here, Archie," I said, tossing the remote into the fireplace. "It was in the Northridge house. In the safe. The one place you thought was secure because you owned the land. I moved it there months ago during one of those forgetful episodes Serafina was so fond of. I sat down on the hearth, the heat of the fire warming my back. The secrets are gone, I said. The debt is gone. And now, the three of you are going to walk out of here, and you are never going to look back. If I ever see a Harrison, or a Montgomery, or a Kensington name in this state again, I'll show the world the backup files I keep in a box that none of you know about. They left. One by one, they walked out into the rain. Archibald was helped into a car by his silent men. Gabriel and Rosemary stood on the porch for a long time, looking back at me, but I didn't move. I didn't wave. I didn't cry. I sat in the quiet of the lodge, the only sound the crackling of the fire. What happened next was the final twist, the one that would truly close the book on the Harrison legacy. Because as I sat there, a single folded note fell out of the ledger. Rosemary had left on the table. A note from my daughter, Serafina, written from her cell only hours before. I opened it, my hands finally, truly steady. The fire in the hearth was down to its final glowing embers, casting long, skeletal shadows across the room. I sat on the floor, the heavy silence of the lodge pressing against my eardrums like the pressure at the bottom of a deep-sea trench. In my hand, the note from Serafina felt heavier than a lead pipe. It was written on a scrap of prison stationery, the handwriting jagged and frantic, a far cry from the elegant, sloping script she had practiced as the golden girl of Greenwich. I opened it, my eyes stinging from the smoke and the bone-deep exhaustion of the last 48 hours. Dad, the note began. I know what you did. I know about the North Ridge house. I know you think you've won. But there's something you never bothered to ask, isn't there? You were always so obsessed with the blueprints of the past that you never looked at the foundation of the present. You think you're saving Julian by cutting me out? Ask Rosemary where she was on the night Julian was born. Ask her why the medical records from that hospital in London are sealed by a court order that even you couldn't break. I felt a cold, familiar dread settle in my gut. I looked toward the door where Rosemary and Gabrielle had exited just minutes ago. The rain was still drumming against the roof, a relentless, rhythmic sound that felt like a countdown. You think Gabriel is your only secret, Dad? Julian isn't Vance's son, and he isn't mine. I did what I had to do to give you the legacy you were so desperate for after you thought I was a disappointment. Rosemary didn't fake her death to protect you. She faked it to hide him. If you ever want to see your grandson again, you'll stop digging. Because the basement isn't just a ledger, Dad. It's a room, and Julian is the only thing inside it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. I stood up, my joints popping like dry twigs. The engineer in me, the part that had spent a lifetime calculating the point of no return, finally understood the true nature of the structure I had built. It wasn't a bridge. It wasn't a skyscraper. It was a labyrinth, and I had been the one wandering its halls for 40 years, while the people I loved held the string. I walked out onto the porch. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. Gabriel was still there, leaning against the Mercedes, his face a mask of weary determination. Rosemary was standing by the edge of the lake, her silhouette a ghostly blur against the dark water. Gabriel, I called out, my voice sounding older than the trees surrounding us. Get in the car. Where are we going, Sterling? He asked, pushing off the fender. To finish the job, I said. I looked at Rosemary. She turned toward me, her eyes wide with a question she was too afraid to ask. I read the note, Rosemary. I know about the room. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking more like a ghost than she ever had during her 5-year disappearance. Sterling, I did it for the family. Archibald, he would have taken him. I had to keep him safe. Safe isn't a secret you keep in the dark for 12 years, Rosemary. I said, the words cutting through the air like a diamond-tipped saw. Safe is the truth. And today, the truth is the only thing that's going to stand. We didn't go back to Greenwich. We didn't go to the police. We drove to a small, nondescript farmhouse on the edge of the Kensington estate, a place I had seen 1,000 times on the maps Archibald had shown me, but had never truly noticed. It was the blind spot in the blueprints, the one room that didn't appear on the master plan. As we pulled up, 2 of Archibald's men stepped out of the shadows, their hands moving toward their jackets. I didn't stop the car. I accelerated, the Mercedes roaring as it crashed through the wooden gate. I slammed on the brakes 10 feet from the front door. Stay here, I told Gabriel. The hell I will, he replied, already out of the car. I walked into that house with a cold, terrifying clarity. I didn't look for Archibald. I didn't look for the ledger. I looked for the sound of a voice, and I found it in a small, well-lit room in the back, filled with books and model bridges. Julian was there. He was 12 years old, with my jawline and Rosemary's violet eyes. He looked up from a drafting table, his expression one of confusion rather than fear. "Grandpa?" he asked, his voice trembling. "They said you were sick. They said you couldn't come for a long time." I walked over and knelt beside him, the weight of the last 40 years finally falling off my shoulders. "I was sick, Julian, but the fever finally broke, and I'm here to take you home." I looked up. Archibald Kensington was standing in the doorway, his face a map of ruin. He didn't have his scotch. He didn't have his remote. He just had the hollow, rattling breath of a man who had finally run out of secrets. "You've destroyed it all, Sterling," Archibald whispered. "The legacy, the name, the order we built. What do you have left?" I stood up, holding my grandson's hand in mine. Gabriel stepped into the room, standing on my other side. Rosemary stood in the hall, her head bowed in a shame that would likely take another 5 years to wash away. "I have a son who knows how to build things that last," I said, looking at Gabriel. "I have a grandson who isn't going to be a secret, and I have a house in Greenwich that's going to be torn down to the studs and rebuilt into something real." I looked Archibald in the eye, the man who had created me. "And you, Archie? You have a basement full of ash and a city that's forgotten your name. I'm an engineer. And the one thing I know for certain is that you can't build a future on a foundation of lies. It always, always collapses." We walked out of that house. We left the Kensington name in the dirt where it belonged. A year later, the site of the Greenwich estate was no longer a monument to excess. It was a park of sprawling, green space designed by the firm of Harrison, Miller. We had used the insurance money and the remnants of the trust to build something that belonged to the people, not the elite. I still have the tremors in my hands sometimes, a reminder of the toxins Serafina tried to feed me. She's still in a cell, serving a 20-year sentence for conspiracy and attempted murder. I visit her once a month. I don't go to yell. I don't go to forgive. I go to show her the pictures of Julian, the boy who is learning to build bridges, not out of steel, but out of the truth. Rosemary is gone now, for real this time. She passed away 6 months after the night at the lodge, the stress of the double life finally giving out. We buried her in the Berkshires, under a tree that overlooks the lake. There is no secret key in her ash box. There are no hidden ledgers. Just a simple stone that says, "The foreman of the heart." Gabriel and I spend our weekends in the workshop. We don't talk about the basement, or the Montgomerys, or the debts. We talk about the load-bearing capacity of hope and the structural integrity of a family that finally learned how to stand. I didn't know it when I was polishing my shoes that rainy Tuesday in October, but my life didn't end when my daughter tried to destroy me. It began. Because sometimes, you have to watch the world you built fall apart to realize that you were standing on the wrong ground all along. The old man who was incompetent is gone. In his place is a man who finally understands that the strongest structures aren't made of concrete and steel. They're made of the people who refuse to let you fall when the wind starts to blow. I am Sterling Harrison. I am 75 years old. And for the first time in my life, the foundation is solid.